Welcome to the Twisted Tale. Thank you for joining us for the second episode in our series of Tales of the Distiller. Tonight we are going to be talking about the rise and fall and rise again of the influence of Pennsylvania in the world of spirits, as well as starting up your own distillery and the trials and tribulations and rewards, hopefully, of doing that. To do that tonight, I am joined by three of Pennsylvania's leading distillers. On my right here we have John Cooper from Dad's Hat. Then we have Jared Adkins from Bluebird, and to my left is Max Pfeffer from Manatawny Stillworks. Thanks, guys, for joining us. Really appreciate it. Thanks for coming out. Obviously, we're familiar with your spirits here in being a Philadelphia bar, and I've definitely enjoyed talking about them to our customers and to our bourbon club. But they are, new boys in the world of whiskey.
Do we compete? Yeah, but not really. We're more complementary to each other. Yeah. As we all do better, like we get recognition, it recognizes the craft in Pennsylvania. These guys get recognition. We're really proud. We send each other congratulatory notes all the time. Pennsylvania actually was really the birthplace of whiskey in the United States. When you go back and you look at history in terms of distilling here in the United States, Pennsylvania, with the Quaker heritage here in Pennsylvania, was very welcoming, and a lot of distillers from like Swiss Mennonites came from Switzerland here to the state of Pennsylvania, and they established themselves here in Pennsylvania and they began distilling. They brought the distilling tradition from the old world over to the new world. They settled in and around the Philadelphia area and then also out further west, out in the Pittsburgh area and throughout the course of the state, and they brought with them all the grains and the utilization of those types of grains in terms of formation of distilled spirits. When you go back into the history of Pennsylvania, rye whiskey was really the king in Pennsylvania early on.
Due to just the abundance of it?
Just the abundance of the type of grain that was available. Yeah. And then what occurred is through the Whiskey Rebellion back in the late 1700s, at the end of the Revolutionary War, when they started to put taxes on whiskey. The government started taxing whiskey really early on in the birth of our country. And that was a revolution against taxation. Those farmers began to migrate over to Kentucky and started to utilize different grains and started the birth of the Bourbon Revolution. For Pennsylvania, particularly in terms of whiskey, there was 163 distilleries in the state of Pennsylvania before Prohibition, licensed distilleries in the state of Pennsylvania. So there's a lot of famous brands that were from here, like Michter's, Old Overholt, Hirsch, Rittenhouse. Those are all originally Pennsylvania brands. The last one to shut down post-Prohibition was actually Michter's, and that was in 1989, and they were just outside Harrisburg.
So how come Kentucky then? Why, it was just Pennsylvania that was taxing? No, it was the whole country.
Well, the whole country was taxing, but keep in mind that Kentucky back then, at the time of the Whiskey Rebellion, Kentucky was a territory. It wasn't a colony, it was a territory. And it was wide open space. There's a lot of places, I guess, to hide back then. But a couple of interesting things that also occurred back in those days was whiskey was originally drunk as white spirit. Aged spirits came about due to the fact that whiskey was stored in barrels. The way in which they would clean barrels and reutilize barrels is they would char them to burn off what was originally used in those barrels, and they would start to store whiskey inside those barrels. And then as they started to ship whiskey over long distances, that is when whiskey started to take on the characteristics of barrel-aged. And barrel-aged whiskey tastes better.
Just because of the time spent?
Because of the time spent.
On boats or something?
Because of the time spent. There's a great story about how Pennsylvania rye would make its way down the Mississippi River down to New Orleans, and the evolution of Sazerac cocktails. So you can start looking back and looking into the different types of cocktails and how whiskeys were utilized in the United States. A lot of it had to do with accidents. A lot of it happened as a result of accidents. Same thing happened in Scotland, again with taxation, when the Scots used to hide their whiskey in barrels to hide it from the tax man. And they'd put it into barrels and they'd hide it, and then when they go back and they'd get it again, Well, lo and behold, all of a sudden it tasted better.
Rye, being the big Pennsylvania grain, that was the big whiskey of the time. A lot of the classic cocktails that we know started with rye. And I know that both of you guys have a rye whiskey that is built as a rye whiskey.
Correct.
Has that been done, John, you're only rye?
We only do rye, yeah.
And you do rye and bourbons.
Correct.
Has the rye production kind of been a tip of the hat to the old days?
Absolutely. So being in Pennsylvania, I feel like we couldn't not make a rye. So starting with bourbon's definitely our flagship, but rye is true to my heart. So that was something right off the bat that I wanted to make. So kind of where I take a little turn from a traditional rye is I use raw rye, but I also use rye malt. So I use a malted rye to be able to convert my starch to my sugar, but then keeping it 100% rye and just really trying to chase after those spicy, peppery flavors that I really love with rye whiskey.
You 100% too?
No, we're 80% rye grain, 5% rye malt, 15% barley malt. But Jared's absolutely correct. You know, it's pre-prohibition style rye in Pennsylvania all had high malt contents. Enzymes didn't exist back then. So when Pennsylvania was king of rye whiskey, the old style Pennsylvania rye had a much higher malt content than what you'll see coming out of Kentucky or coming out of Canada or coming out of Indiana, which is a lot of rye come out of Indiana nowadays. They all have much higher rye contents. And I think what malted rye and malted barley does is it softens the flavor of the rye and brings in some of the fruit content while not diminishing the high spice, which Pennsylvania ryes are characteristic of. You know, Pennsylvania rye rules are high percentage of rye grain, high percentage of malt, no corn whatsoever, and then a sweet mash, no sour mash.
Right. And so you mentioned Pennsylvania rye a couple of times. You would classify that as an actual distinction within the family of rye, right?
Yeah, it's a distinct style. Pennsylvania styles are noted for their spice and for their softness on the back of the palate. Pennsylvania was the largest producer of rye whiskey before Prohibition, and Maryland was the second largest producer of rye whiskey before Prohibition. And the Maryland style is a little softer than the Pennsylvania style, right? Fine.
So both of your products are purposefully styled after Pennsylvania rye?
Yes.
Correct.
Max, you don't have a rye that you bill as a rye.
That's correct.
You use rye.
A little bit, not much.
A little bit, not much. But your whiskeys you have purposefully blended and created to be a little bit different than what you might expect.
Exactly. I kind of took a little bit of a different approach than John and Jared here. I came from the craft beer world. Actually, Jared and I actually worked at the same brewery, but not at the same time. It was Victory. When I got a chance to make my own whiskey, I really wanted to explore what whiskey can be. So I purposely didn't make a rye, purposely didn't make a bourbon. I wanted to make something unique. So I took my experience as a brewer, so my whiskey tends to be a little bit malt heavy, and then I kind of spun it a little bit. I took some ideas from the European styles, I took some ideas from the American styles, and kind of made my own style of whiskey. So because of that, I have a truly unique whiskey. It's not what people are used to. Everybody always tastes it and it's like, this is different.
Yeah.
And I like that, and I like having that differentiation in
That's
there.
presumably the reaction you want.
Yeah,
You
exactly.
go to those lengths to make it different. You want people to think that it's different.
Exactly, yep. Whiskey is essentially just distilled beer. You leave the hops out, and that's what whiskey is. So if you have, if you can make good beer, you're more than halfway on your way to making a good whiskey. One of the things I do differently than these two guys is that I don't even make my own beer. So my distillery is actually located right across the street from Sly Fox Brewing Company. And when I make my whiskey, I start in their brew house. They make the base of my whiskey, and I literally drive it across the street over to my place. It also forced me into a different style. So when I make my whiskeys, my whiskeys are what's called off the grain. So just as you do in beer and more of the European style, we lauter. So we remove the spent grain from the wash, the liquid, the sugar water itself. And it gives you a completely different character, because then when you put it into the still, you're not boiling the grains, which will give you a little bit more of the grassy, kind of more earthy characters that you get from typical American whiskey. So that's kind of where really a big part of where my beer influence comes in is making more of that European beer-focused whiskey.
Is there a Manatawny Sly Fox beer? Can you go to Sly Fox and get a beer of
No.
your stuff?
My recipe is unique. It's something that I make. They haven't
That'd
actually
be an
turned that
interesting
into.
pairing.
I'll talk to
I
Brian
know,
about
we should
that.
have
yeah.
that here.
And when we got started, we actually did a lot of work with Michigan State University. We were one of the first groups to go through their Distillers program. And we actually shipped 2 tons of rye grain from here in Pennsylvania to Michigan, went up there and made whiskey with them on a still very similar to what we have now. When Max is absolutely right. You go through the process of grinding your grain, distilling your grain, and what we do is we do put the grain fully into distill. We do the full American style, and we picked our yeast through working with Michigan State University, and developed all of our processes through working with them. And we did our experimentation batches with them before we actually got started on site at our own distillery.
And have you stayed true to those processes and recipes and everything?
Yeah, we have. We refined them a bit over time. We have refined them a bit. We've gotten better at it as we've been doing it since we started distilling in September 2011. So we've refined them and gotten better at what we do. We got better sources of grain now. And I think the grain, when you start out with your whiskey, is really important. The quality of the grain that you get, I think, makes a big difference. We're very fortunate in that we got a great relationship with the farmers we work with, and we've really been able to capitalize on that, and it's had an impact on the flavor of our whiskey.
Well, that's still a bonus, I guess, of Pennsylvania setups, is we're surrounded by farmland and farmers who are still
Yeah, it
staying
does
true
help.
to
It
the
does
original
help quite
ways
a
of
bit.
organic growing.
Making rye.
And I guess I do one thing different than you guys too. So I do untemperature controlled fermentations with an open top. So I do similar to John with doing the grains. And it's funny, we were looking at temperature controlled fermenters, and right now we're using just large open top fermenters that aren't temperature controlled. And I actually get more flavors and esters out of doing a higher temperature fermentation, of really talking actually 85 to 90 degrees, which is completely unheard of in the beer market, where we were back down to like 60 to 70.
That's interesting.
But I tried a ton of temperatures, everywhere from 60 degrees up to 95 degrees, and the flavor that I liked the best actually came from the higher fermentation temperatures.
See, we do open top, but we do it at 80 degrees.
Okay, yeah.
And we do controlled temperature at 80 degrees, but open top.
We were talking earlier, John, and you said you were number 3 distilling license to be issued in the state of Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
And that was 7 years ago, right?
Yep, back in beginning of 2011 is when we got our license. And it's kind of a weird process you got to go through. You actually have to have a street address, right? And then you have to have a still number. You actually have to order your still. You have to sign a lease, order your still, and you have to do all that before you can actually apply for your license.
Oh, really?
Before you can apply for your license. Yeah, as we like to say, this is a business that's not for the faint of heart or light of wallet. We were the first craft whiskey distillery in the state, and I think I saw something just the other day that there's up to 80
insane.
licenses in the state now. So I guess we're halfway back to the 163
Yeah, we're halfway,
original.
back to glory.
halfway back to the original 163 licensed distilleries in the state.
Still 80 licenses within 7-year period. That's quite a boom that I would say Pennsylvania is going through. Putting out rums, gins that you guys do, is that a marketing choice or a business choice so you could get something quickly to market and have some kind of a return whilst your whiskeys are sitting in the barrels and waiting? Or was it always, hey, I really want a full spectrum of brands in my line?
I would like to say, from a pure stance that, I did it only because, but we are running a business.
Yeah.
So there are business constraints. So part of our business model was to have a gin, which is a small turnaround time, have a light rum. But those are things that kind of, you start, but where we focus on is the whiskeys, the aged whiskeys.
When I'm sitting at the distillery, my brain's always turning about, I want to make other stuff as well. So, it's great to focus on my main products, but I also want to have something else, even if it's just in the distillery, just something fun that I can get to be creative and still have some fun at. And
You did like a blueberry brandy not too long ago, right?
I have a blueberry brandy, a peach brandy, an apple brandy, a barrel-aged gin, you name it.
Whatever the season gives
You know,
you.
I'm going to leave it at the distillery, but just having a lot of fun on the side projects.
We only make rye, right? Every single one of our whiskeys all has exactly the same mash bill, but we experiment with different types of aging techniques. So we'll do, at the distillery, occasionally we'll release a double wood, where we'll take it out of one barrel and we'll put it back into another barrel that's been used, and we'll let that age varying periods of time. We've done spiced, different types of flavor ryes, different types of things. So sometimes you'll get different batches that'll taste somewhat differently. We'll do different structures on blending, and we'll do those types of things. But we only make rye. I mean, we've resisted the temptation to make things other than that, because our business model dictates that is in fact what we need to do in order to be successful.
Speaking of which, can I try your straight rye?
Of course.
There we go.
Please.
So I'm drinking your straight rye also, right
Yeah.
here.
I guess, sir.
And you were saying that, now this is a 2-year product, right?
3.
That's straight.
3-year product.
Yeah, I just got
Yeah,
some
that's
And
down.
full-size barrels, 53 gallons.
Yeah, that's a blend of 36 to 45-month-old barrels.
And you said earlier that it's not for the light of wallet, this
Correct.
business.
Yeah, correct.
Presumably a lot, other than having to get all of your equipment and stills, which I'm sure are gazillions of dollars, a lot of that comes from you've made the product, now you have to wait for a year, 2 years, 3 years before you put it out to market. And
Yeah.
it's just sitting there, there's your money on a shelf, and you're crossing your fingers that one day it's going to sell.
Yeah, you have to hedge your bets. We did decide early on that we could age whiskey in small barrels. And there was, early in the craft spirits phase, there was a big argument and a big debate about could you make whiskey in small barrels? And a lot of people were saying, well, you can't make good whiskey in small barrels. That's not true. You can make different whiskey in small barrels. And that was one of the things that we emphasized. So, like our number one seller is Dad's Hat Pennsylvania Rye. That's aged in 15-gallon barrels. That whiskey is 8.5 months old. Very, very young. The nice thing about rye is good young.
Yeah.
You know, you can do that with a rye.
Yeah, you want those young,
Yeah.
spicy, youthful
Young,
characteristics to
spicy,
come out.
vibrant, and we go with a very tight cut from the still, so it's almost pure hearts with a very small amount of tails is what we do in our small barrels. We waited a while before we started putting whiskey away in 53-gallon barrels, because it's really expensive to put spirit away in 53-gallon barrels. We wanted to make sure that we had a whiskey that people would drink before we started investing in putting this stuff away in bigger barrels for a longer period of time.
Oh, that's how you're supposed to do it.
I'm not sure if that's how you're supposed to do it. That's how we decided to do it.
What is the camaraderie like between you guys and the other distillers in the area? Is there a lot of competition? Do you not talk to each other except for things like this when you pretend to be friends, or is there actually a good friendship and you call each other up and say,
Yeah, we hate
"Yo,
each
John,
other. We
I'm-
hate each other's guts. We
I'm
can't
good."
stand it.
Yeah.
I mean, I feel like this is how it is. We know each other pretty well. You know, even coming here, we see each other all the time. And Max and I were out partying last month.
To me, I look at it as co-opetition. So it's, we are working together to fight the mass-produced products. So if someone drinks a craft whiskey, that's a win. I don't care if it's mine, Jared's, John's, because they're going to see how awesome John's whiskey is, how awesome Jared's whiskey is. They're going to give a shot to my whiskey.
How is Pennsylvania as a state? Obviously, they run the rules and regulations for you guys, but for helping you get that whiskey out there, like all of your products are in the state stores, and the state store now has a section that is focused just on Pennsylvania spirits, which presumably is a great thing for you guys. What are the challenges? What have you gone through with dealing with them?
We started early on with PLCB. I mean, our theory was that we're a Pennsylvania brand. We need to establish ourselves in Pennsylvania. So,
What you did with the label, right off
which
the bat.
we do with the label, we did with the shape of the bottle, we did with the label, we did with the whole thing with the Keystone. All of this is in reference to Pennsylvania style, which is the Pennsylvania style of rye whiskey. So we embrace that, but we have no complaints about the PLCB. PLCB has been a very good friend of ours. They're our number one customer.
Yeah.
And as long as you understand how to work with them and you go to that level, they're good. When we started in 2011, you couldn't sell your own whiskey in your own distillery. You couldn't pour samples in your own distillery. Now, we started distilling in September 2011. By the end of the fourth quarter in 2011, that changed. So then we were able to do it at our distillery. And we've kind of watched the laws evolve, and we've watched how the state has embraced craft distilling.
We do well in the state as well, but being a newcomer too, where we might have, I think we've been probably for a full year now within the PLCB. It's definitely getting harder we've had to work to be able to get, mainly just because you have, we're saying 80 craft distilleries, there's a lot now going in all at one time. So I think they're getting kind of bombarded with, hey, we have 50 brands trying to come in all at once. So it's fantastic working with them, but I think it's definitely getting more difficult to try to get a new product in and just get that time to be able to.
And it's going to continue. I think it's going to continue to get a little bit more difficult.
You said earlier to me that you're represented in 18 states.
We're in 18 states.
And
yes.
how many countries did you say?
22.
So I'm the newest out of these guys, so we're in 3 states right
similar
now.
to
So we're
your
in
plan?
Pennsylvania,
Yeah.
Illinois, and New Jersey, and then hopefully branch into Delaware and Maryland this year. But it's been a great process so far, and we're kind of doing it respectively of owning our home market first and doing the way it should be, and then venturing off. So.
That's similar.
Yeah, we're in about 4 states now: New York, Maryland, Delaware, DC, and New Jersey. You know, it definitely gets a lot harder the further you go away from home. You know, within 10 miles of the distillery, everybody drinks Manatawny. 15 miles, 20 miles, the further you go out, the more difficult it is. So it's definitely very difficult to deal with distribution.
When we were talking with Jimmy Russell a couple of weeks ago, we were talking about like the trend of the whiskey industry as a whole, which obviously has boomed over the last 5, 7, 8 years. Being, you know, kind of young companies coming up into that as that boom is happening, how do you try to predict with your agings and your distribution and your expansion into different states and countries of you know, this is how many barrels I need, this is the production level that I need to be at right now in order to keep up with demand? How does that factor into your business model as a growing distiller?
It's a guessing game. You know, I was talking to John a little bit earlier. You know, you would have made different decisions 3 years ago. I would have made different decisions 3 years ago. Yes, you know, even something like Scotch, you're starting to see less age statements on Scotch. Well, that's because 18 years ago, they get strong.
I put away as much whiskey as I can afford to put away right now. So all my spare cash goes right into putting whiskey barrels. So last year we made around 600 barrels and just sat them away. So kind of, there's all your profit goes right into that. But, you know, figure I'll make it and then I'll worry about selling it later. And hopefully
It keeps on that upswing.
Well, you have to.
He said the key thing is you put away as much whiskey as you can afford to put it away. There's multiple different factors that come into play. It's how much production time do you actually have? How much can you afford to actually put away? What are you going to do? You don't want to cut any corners, so you want to still stay with high quality. I mean, one of the things that we all do is we use the highest quality of ingredients. All this stuff is very, very expensive. Barrels. 2 years ago, there was a massive barrel shortage.
I started right during that shortage.
Massive barrel shortage. On the other hand, you know, as you start to think about when you're going to expand with more barrels, you got to work with those people and you say, okay, can you make this many more barrels for us? So we ran into a problem with our wine barrels. Last year, I had to put all of our distributors on allocation on our vermouth finish and on our portwood finish, including the state of Pennsylvania, which did not go over very well.
Since we started after John, after the law changed, we were able to adapt to the kind of the new laws as we started. So Jared and I both serve cocktails at our bar. We both can drink by the glass, try a lot of different seasonal craft cocktails. It's a great way to introduce people who are not as knowledgeable about the industry or about craft spirits into into the world by putting into a delicious cocktail.
How have you found the support of the local bars and restaurants that are carrying your products?
For us, we have fantastic relationships with local bars. I feel like a lot of bars are really starting to embrace the local feeling for local spirits throughout our local area, and especially throughout the city here.
It's going to be a while before you walk into any given bar and you see all 3 of our spirits on the shelf. So there's an appreciation for it from certain bars and restaurants, and they've done amazing. Like I couldn't be where I am now without the partnerships that we've had. But we're not in every bar, and we shouldn't be in every bar, and we're not trying to be in every bar because, depending on what that bar is, what their message is, what they're trying to do, it might not be the right spot for us. So that was an important lesson for us when we first got started, is that, when people say, no, I don't want your stuff, it doesn't fit what I'm trying to do, it was hard. You don't like that rejection, but you start to understand the industry, and it's, we're running a business, but they're also running a business. So it's, we have to help each other. And if we don't help each other, then, neither of us are going to be successful.
So what have you guys got coming up? What's exciting on the horizon for everyone?
We actually just released our first straight whiskey. This was our anniversary whiskey. That was 3 years to the day for our 3-year anniversary. So we continue to kind of do these batch whiskeys. So we'll keep on kind of trying new things. I'm not too dissimilar to Jared. Always want to try something new and different. One of the cool things that we have coming up is we're actually going to do a gin aged in a tequila barrel. Which will kind of be a very different, interesting idea.
Bluebird's got a bunch of good stuff coming up. We just released a wheat whiskey to make the trio of our whiskeys complete. So that's pretty great, and it's going to the PLCB stores whenever they get back to me here, so hopefully that's pretty soon. But we just released that at the distillery. Have a single malt coming out, and then a bunch of brandy projects this summertime at the distillery. And then our last biggest thing, we're coming downtown here and opening a little shop at the Shops of Liberty, just so people can have more convenient access to our products here in the Philadelphia market. And we have more of a spot to be able to release some of these fun little creative ventures that I do as well. I know Max is doing a tasting room as well here coming up.
Thanks for reminding me.
Yeah.
Probably should have said that. Passion Gav.
Passion Gav
Shops
tasting
of
room for
Liberty
Manatawny.
runs that.
We'll continue to do a couple of unique releases at the distillery. We've got a double wood that's going to come out, maybe before Father's Day. We'll probably release another bottled and bond before Father's Day. And that's basically about it. We're actually looking at some of this tasting room type of thing. It's not something that we've done, but it's something we may do. We may do it in conjunction with a couple of the other distilleries.
Thank you for joining me.
Thank you.
I think it's important to note for everyone watching, obviously these products are listed in the state stores. Please go and find them. Please support local and Pennsylvania products.
Drink
but
beer,
also,
whiskey.
there you go. But also go and visit everyone at their distilleries. It's a fun time.
Tours
Visit
are
the
always a
tasting
lot of
room,
fun.
go for a tour, learn about how they make this in depth. I definitely recommend it. And basically just enjoy the products. So thank you for your time. Cheers.
Thank you. Cheers.
Bring it in.
Max, I have a little bit more of that anniversary
Yeah, I
one.
want to try that too.
Yeah, pass the whiskeys around.